Because one of the most interesting things over the last few weeks, months, is the amount of deals that are being done without the United States. I mean, we've had this breakthrough deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by China. We now have what looks like a reconciliation between Syria and Saudi Arabia as well. We're having moves, as you correctly, I mean, I'm sure you're right, by the way, about in India and China coming together. We've had Putin meeting Xi Jinping in Moscow. And from what I can understand, that was also mainly about economics, not arms or anything of that kind. Do you think there's any chance, though, because this is the other thing they always talk about, is that China will now step in and try to mediate the Ukraine war, that this is the next move that the Chinese are planning on? Again, I have to say, I don't actually personally see much sign of this, but what sense about that did you get in Beijing, maybe?
You know, I think the Chinese view is on the war is very clear, which is this war is not good for the world. It's, first of all, not good for Ukraine. It should stop. It is a war to a very significant extent about NATO expansion, which China certainly does not support. In fact, it regards as pretty irresponsible of the U.S. And so I think China's main message from the start, and it was in my discussions as well, China says there are security interests of both Ukraine and Russia that need to be met. That's the key sentence of everything that China has said and everything that China's put on the table, and I agree with it 100%. To my mind, it means the core of ending this war is President Biden saying NATO will not enlarge anymore, basically, and it will not enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia. That was the fundamental cause of all of this going back 20 years, in my view. And I think it's China's understanding of this as well, and why China absolutely will support Russia in that basic point. Russia has real security interests in not having NATO surrounded in the Black Sea region, not have it in Ukraine and Georgia. It's been my feeling for 30 years, that basic idea. And I think China understands that very well. So that's the sense in which I think China is very constructive in this. There will be others, and I was going to be in China at the same time that President Lula was to arrive, but he postponed his trip because he was ill, and he's coming in mid-April. But Lula actually aims to, and I think can, play a meaningful role in pushing the U.S. and Russia to real negotiation over these critical issues. And the relations of China and Brazil will be very, very strong. So I think China's role is real in this. I don't think it's going to be orchestrating a full public diplomacy, but I think it will be playing an important role quietly as it does to say, look, the basis for this war to end starts with the U.S. and Russia, and it starts with NATO dropping what has been the neocon project for 30 years now, which is the relentless expansion of the U.S. military alliance. And I actually believe that's the basis for ending this war at the negotiating table. So I think China will play a very important, quiet role in that regard. But, you know, of all of the things that have happened, and as you mentioned, I think the rapprochement of Saudi Arabia and Iran is both remarkable. It is a great diplomatic achievement also of China, but it's also the way of the world, in my view, which is that if neighbors actually get along with each other, this world could actually solve a lot of problems. And neighbors can, cooperate on many very practical economic things. And that, to my mind, is what's taking shape. And what we ought to watch is the neighbors, India and China, but also the neighbors, China, Japan, and Korea, because that's another one that's going to change. Right now, the U.S. alignment is Japan and Korea have to be, rapidly anti-Chinese. But watch that screen. That's going to change also in the next couple of years. A lot of Koreans are saying to me how incredibly unhappy they are with the hard line that the U.S. is pushing Korea to take vis-a-vis China. And I think that that's the next one that's actually going to start to change. And once Northeast Asia is not this U.S.-China divide, that's going to be another tremendous step in this new multipolar world. And I think it's going to happen.
I visited Korea about 20 years ago, South Korea, I should make it clear. And I was struck even then by how close, the influence of China was with Korea, how well these two countries know each other already, millennial history. And to think that you can just sort of manipulate the relationship between these two countries.
No, it's crazy because, I go to the three countries all the time. I know the leaders in all three. If they would get together, my God, the powerhouse of China, Japan, and Korea, technologically, economically, financially, unbelievable. It's so good, it's going to happen, actually.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. And we were talking about Japan, and it's making some moves of its own because it's now opting out of the oil price caps. It's got, the oil price caps on the Russians that the US is imposing. Does anybody in the United States, at a sort of senior level, quite understand that this bullying policy is actually weakening the US's positions instead of strengthening them? And that, in fact, the US has huge opportunities here for itself if it would just drop this and change its approach. I mean, I read actually somewhere it was a Chinese thing that China's rise economically is an opportunity for the United States, as it should be for everybody.
The short answer is no. I haven't seen any glimmer of insight right now in the kind of East Coast university think tanks, and certainly in Washington. To talk about insight is the first oxymoron. There isn't right now. It's a little weird. It is. We're in a time warp, actually, in the U.S. right now. There's so little understanding. There's so much snarling. There's so little recognition of how deeply off track the foreign policy is. There are voices around, but not much wisdom right now. So I'm, hoping that somehow we muddle through this very difficult period, and a couple politicians have the guts to start, or have the insight to start understanding things aren't working right. And maybe it is, I don't know what it is, but I can tell you it's pretty dispiriting. Also in the university context, because the U.S. is dotted with think tanks, and the think tanks are all pretty much neocon oriented at the major universities, and it hasn't really broken through that this makes no sense. I'm sorry to say it. I wish I could tell you, behind the scenes everyone knows, but it's a pretty low level discussion right now.
Because the other thing is, I also read some of the reports that come from these think tanks, and two things come through to me always these very complicated geopolitical chess games, which I always find fantastic in themselves, yes. But also very little discussion ever of economics. When they talk about these chess games, the assumption is, yes, we can do all of these things, but very little understanding. The economics is ultimately what determines everything, and what also places limits on what you can do. It's as if these chess games are played in some kind of isolation.
You know, there's a huge naivete and maybe a kind of underlying racism, though it's not quite the right term. It's a little sharp, but there is a deep feeling that whatever China did, it must have cheated to do it. And that's almost taken as granted, taken for granted. It's the weirdest thing. You know, I've been traveling to China for 40 years now. A lot of Chinese students, a lot of supervised dissertations and research projects and so on. And I've watched the hard work, the intelligent planning, the incredible foresight that China has shown for 40 years in this economic success. And yet the line, it's all dismissed. And it's dismissed by, you know, even the academics. And so this is part of the self-aggrandizing fallacy that prevents the clear thinking. Well, all we have to do is turn off this switch or stop them from cheating on this, and then the game is up for them. And that's why you see all these naive moves of, you know, we'll put on a sanction here, we'll stop them from getting semiconductors here, we'll squeeze Huawei here. And it's unbelievably naive, but it's the similar motivation to the sanctions against Russia or the sanctions against Venezuela, which is it starts with the kind of arrogance that we're the only ones that know how to do anything. So all we have to do is flip a switch and the others just collapse. And they forget there's actually real people, smart people all over the place that know how to do a lot of things, and that technology flows, technology is shared, technology moves in all different directions. And this is the biggest single misunderstanding of the US scene right now, is the sense we're still in charge because we're the ones that know how to do things. And we see every day it's all bollocksed up.
I have to say very briefly that if you go to late imperial Britain, it was not exactly the same. The British understood that they were, that they were being overtaken, and they looked for friends. There was even a famous speech by, Joseph Chamberlain, that we're the weary Atlas. We can't carry the burden of the globe anymore. He was the colonial secretary at the time. There doesn't seem to be anyone like that in the United States with his kind of power at the moment. And, one wonders why that is.
You know, I read, I've been rereading Robert Kagan, the great ideologue of the neocons. Really a horrible book, 2018. I think we've discussed it, The Jungle Grows Back. And it's about U.S. Liberal hegemony and all the rest. But I understand from rereading it where the complete misperception comes in, which is that the world for the US is overwhelmingly the US, and then there's Europe, and then there's Japan, and the rest is a kind of haze, which doesn't quite have the right to be there. And China's, where'd they come from? But no deep recognition that the West, so-called, is 15% of the world population in a world where technology is going everywhere very, very quickly. And I was in India just after China and for a G20 meeting. And in the pavilion was demonstrations of India's digital things. And I was saying, God, I wish I could do this stuff in New York City. What they're doing out in the rural areas of India with their digital lockers and their e-payment systems and everything else is absolutely remarkable. And this is the real point of everything that we're seeing. There isn't a Western-led world anymore. There is a world. And and the technology is flowing everywhere, and you can find it in remote villages in Africa as well, though still lagging far behind. But you definitely see it in China, it's daily life. In India, the breakthroughs are coming quickly. That's the real world. That's the geopolitical world, because that's the real world.
Yeah.
And that's why everything else about we will write the rules of the game, which Americans still say openly, is just bizarre, actually.
Bizarre. There is the real world, and there is the world, not the West, it's the world altogether. We've come up to our 30 minutes, Professor Sachs. Can I say it was an amazing program? Thank you very much for joining us, Alex. And
I just want to know, Professor Sachs, can I shoot 2 messages your way?
Absolutely.
Okay. Two or three messages. A lot of people are asking, from P. Cooper, for example, how far away is the new fiat system? And Jungle Jin wants to know if central banks like the ECB can actually fail.
Central banks can print money, but if their money fails, they get hyperinflation when they do so. So there have been a lot of failed central banks in history. I've dealt with a number of them, trying to resurrect them. We're within 10 years of a new international monetary system. We see it taking shape before our eyes. The dominance of the dollar, which is a lot of the American perception of its dominance of power, is an obsolescing bargain, as we say in economics. It's going away. My colleagues think, 30 or 40 years. I'd say less than 10 years, because the moves geopolitically combined with the technological transformation to digital currencies, meaning you don't have to go through SWIFT. We're going to have central bank digital currencies, and we're going to have a multi-currency world. My guess is within 10 years, we're in a very different international monetary system.
All right. And Alan wants to know, why do Eastern countries not dump the dollar, like Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on?
They're going to. This is happening before our eyes, actually. There's more and more bilateral settlements in rupees, in rubles, in renminbi. It's happening very fast. Again, there are established systems and so on. But if it's a guess, is this closer to 30 or 40 years, or is this closer to 5 to 10 years? I definitely give it the 5 to 10 year period. And like in so many other things, the renminbi is going to be a big part of this story.
All right. Fantastic. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director, Columbia University, the Center for Sustainable Development. I will have a link to that website in the description box down below, as well as a pinned comment. Thank you very much, Jeffrey Sachs, once again, for your time. It is very appreciated. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you to all our moderators and to everyone who watched us on this live stream. Take care.
No, we're definitely in rough waters. We're in a crisis. The crisis will get worse in the coming months, and it could get far worse. We're experiencing stagflation, meaning that there are rising prices at the same time that output is falling in many parts of the world. Europe is already in a downturn. The United States is entering a downturn. China is in some kind of economic downturn. So this is a global economic crisis. And so I regard the overall economic situation as bad as I've seen in decades, worse than in 2008. We're likely to experience some very significant shocks in the months ahead. Of course, the most crucial question is what happens to geopolitics. Does war spread? Does it intensify? Does it diminish? Is there a return to the negotiating table? Do the US and China come to blows which would disrupt global society? Do they find a way to talk with each other? These are the questions that we're facing right now.
It's true that this is all also happening on the backdrop of an immense debt leverage that the global economy what do you think is the optimal solution to the current global debt overhang? And by debt, I mean private,
everything.
public, everything. I'm just rounding up. I don't even want to think about the figure because it's too many zeros. So what's the solution to that so it doesn't threaten the world's global financial system and stability?
It's a great question. Again, in the last stagflation that we had in the late 1970s, what happened was that the inflation in the United States reached around 10% per year, and the Fed, under a 6'7", a 2-meter chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, cigar smoking, tough guy. He said, we're going to end this inflation. And he put interest rates up to 20%. And by the time it was over, all the developing countries were bankrupt. It was unbelievable. Well, it made my career because I spent the next decade helping countries get out of debt crisis, which had laid them completely flat. So if we go into this just with a naive financial squeeze right now, we'll end up with a lot of carnage, meaning a lot of countries in default, a lot of very high inflation rates. You look at a country like Turkey now. They have not managed their economy properly for years, but the inflation rate is reaching 100% per year right now. Argentina, the inflation rate is reaching 100%. There will be other countries experiencing this kind of runaway inflation. Maybe Ukraine is going to have a hyperinflation by the end of this crisis. Of course, we don't know.
But unlike 30 years ago or 40 years ago, actually, well, almost 50 to be exact, is the developed world, are the developed economies and their financial system insulated from this impact that could be coming again from emerging markets or developing economies?
It's interesting, you know, of course, in the 2010s, because the European Central Bank did not do a very good job under its president, Trichet, in the early years of the last decade, Greece nearly went bankrupt. And it wasn't so far for Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and even Italy. And so the Eurozone and Slovenia, the Eurozone almost collapsed. And it required Draghi's deft hand to prevent that collapse. Basically, the European Central Bank had to act as a lender of last resort to prevent a disaster. So central banks and their wisdom or lack of wisdom will determine a lot. In 2008, the Fed and the U.S. Treasury stupidly drove Lehman Brothers into a bankruptcy one weekend in September 2008, and it cost the whole world trillions of dollars, that technical mistake that they made. And so when you're in a crisis, the first thing to say is these institutions are not so reliable. They're not so smart. They're not so foolproof that they necessarily avoid real damage. What we need to come to the positive answer to your question is we need to avoid a contagion of defaults and a contagion of insolvencies. And we also need to avoid simply telling dozens of countries, you need to contract sharply your public investment and your social spending and so forth.
So you effectively coming full circle from what, you know, being the sort of from professing shock therapies, you are coming full circle into actually going against these sort of fiscal cuts in the country.
No. Remember, when I was advocating shock therapy, I was advocating that governments not print money or issue money in order to finance budget deficits. But I was constantly recommending that the international finance help the countries to avoid defaults or crises. One of the key pillars of shock therapy in Bolivia and Poland, for example, was a cancellation of the debts of those countries, the foreign debts. So I argued that to pay the foreign debts in Bolivia would have condemned the country to a rampant hyperinflation. And in the end, Bolivia's external debt to international banks was cut by about 90% at my recommendation. Similarly, in Poland, in that shock therapy, I recommended that Poland's debt overhang should be relieved. The debt that Poland owed, especially to its official creditors, should be cut very, very sharply, and that indeed happened. So I did not recommend simply austerity and contraction. I recommended always that the international counterparts, the creditors, play a role, a constructive role, a positive role in preventing crisis in debtor countries.
And in debt relief, regardless the potential risk of moral hazard
Well, debt relief depends on the circumstances. In the circumstances today, I'm not recommending cancellation of the face value of debts. What I am recommending is that one way or another, and it depends very much on the specific circumstances, that countries get the kinds of development finance that they need, even on a larger scale than now. And I'm talking about new debts on a long-term, low-interest rate basis so that these countries can continue to develop without going into default today. It's a tricky proposition for countries that have borrowed on the Eurobond market, governments that owe money right now. It may be that they have to say to the creditors, well, we need to extend the horizon for repayment under certain kinds of contracts where there are collective action clauses. This can be done fairly smoothly, and probably many countries are going to have to take that chance. When it comes to official credits that a government owes to a rich country government or to the World Bank or to some other international institution, I'm recommending a set of measures to make sure that the developing countries are getting more finance in fresh form than they are repaying on old debts. There are many ways to do that, but I'm basically saying don't print money. I've never believed in that because you just get high inflation, but rather let's get a financial solution that doesn't condemn the country to default or to bankruptcy or to extreme austerity. That's actually always been my policy recommendation since I started this approach in Bolivia in 1985.
And is it achievable under the current circumstances when the US Fed is fighting a 40-year high inflation and has been pushing up interest rates higher to the unprecedented high for, let's say, several decades going back, because that's actually been increasing the debt load or debt gearing of and servicing costs, debt servicing costs for all the EMs or developing countries?
It's going to be a close call for several reasons, but let me put it this way. Currently, the 30-year bond rate of the U.S. Treasury is about 3.2%, still quite low. The 30-year bond rate for German debt is still around 1%, actually. The 30-year bond rate for Ghana or for an emerging economy, if they can get a 30-year loan, is 10%. In other words, I am advocating a significant increase of official financing at interest rates that the Treasury or the German government or other Eurozone countries pay themselves. The real room for maneuver is that the interest rates paid by the high-income countries are still very low compared to what the emerging market economies face. What I'm suggesting, therefore, is a major expansion of funds coming from the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that essentially can borrow on terms very close to what the US government or German government or Japanese government can borrow at, and therefore lend at quite low and long-term interest rates to emerging markets that, if they are left on their own, face horrendous terms that would drive them into default.
And then we are back into the whole idea of like the currently lack of cooperation will on the global level. We have to get back.
There you go. So I'm recommending to the G20 this approach. But is there a G20 even right now? Countries are barely talking to each other. The US and Russia literally are not talking to each other, of course. US and China barely talking to each other and cooperating on something as bold as avoiding a financial crisis. Somehow it's not going well. And for me, all through my career, even when I didn't understand it properly at the time, it has been determined by geopolitics. Will something work or won't it work? Because you need cooperation. If the cooperative environment is there, a lot can get done. If there is no cooperation, the chance for a contagion is very, very real. This, I think, is what we face right now.
I have a last question on this topic. The ECB is facing a real difficult times and dilemma. Even, I mean, it's behind the tightening curve, launched by the Fed earlier in the season. What can ECB do to actually, put its policies back straight on the right course of like sustaining that kind of development and preventing any global financial crisis, or maybe world financial crisis number 2 following 2008, 2009?
Well, I think Europe is in an extremely difficult situation, not mainly because of the ECB, but mainly because of the war in Ukraine and the vulnerability on energy, obviously. Europe's already in a downturn. It could get quite severe in the coming months. My position on this is not popular in Europe among the politicians, but as I've emphasized, my position is that there is a negotiated way out of this. I don't believe the NATO line that, well, we're just going to fight till we defeat Putin. If that is the approach, I don't think it's going to succeed on the battlefield. And I also think that the consequences economically will become quite unmanageable. The crisis will be very serious in my view. Now, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I believe that the energy crisis and all of the uncertainties around it and all of the other ramifications, and you compound that with the growing break with China as well, I think will lead to a very significant crisis in Europe. And since we see the politics are already quite unstable in a number of countries, including Italy, for example, where the Draghi government has just fallen, and who knows what will happen next with elections coming up, I think that the chance of revisiting a deep Eurozone crisis becomes very real. So I don't see the pieces working very well right now. And the ECB can only do so much in this context. I think it's going to have an extremely difficult time unless we find a way to peace and to easing the very, very high tensions right now.
You are viewed, and correct me if I'm wrong, as the co-author or co-father of the United Nations development goals that are used in the currently, often discussed ESG policies. And you are the Columbia University Director of the Center for Sustainable Development. And what does it mean? What is your typical day like in this role?
Great question. Typically, it's zooming from early morning till late at night, because now in our digital world, we can meet and speak all over the world rather conveniently.
And do it sustainably.
And do it depending on how exactly the electricity is provided for our Zooms. That remains a question, but it's much more sustainable than getting on an airplane for every meeting that one has to have. I spend a tremendous amount of my day, every day, working on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. I believe, as I've been emphasizing, that global cooperation is necessary, is vital, and is feasible. I don't believe in a divided world. I don't believe in democracies versus autocracies. I don't believe in cold wars or hot wars. I believe that our environmental and social crises are so severe that we need cooperation right now above all of the differences that we might suppose to divide the world. And so I speak with the Chinese, I speak with Latin America, African leaders, European leaders all the time. And I promote solutions, as we discussed, for the financial crisis, which is deepening, for the climate crisis, which is deepening. And I help to lead a network of more than 1,500 universities around the world to address, through education and research and policy analysis, how to promote sustainable development. And war is my enemy, obviously, because it's the biggest distraction. It sucks up all the energy. It destroys so much faster than we can possibly build. It undermines every opportunity for trust and partnership. So these days I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to see, is there some way to overcome this two-front crisis that we face with Russia and China against the U.S. And its alliance. And I always appeal for Europe to be smarter in its diplomacy, because Europe has the values of sustainable development, yet it's caught in war. And I want to see Europe get out of this trap of war, not fall into a trap of a new battle with China, and help lead the way to a cooperative approach to sustainable development.
How do you see the latest efforts by US and EU authorities in sort of codifying the ESG rules? How do you see the current approach to that? Whether it should be sort of better codified from the above, rather than sort of driven from below by the markets?
It definitely, we need top-down codification and top-down policies. And very broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is a valid, smart, I would say sophisticated approach. It's got many limitations, but the European Green Deal is a framework that the 27 have adopted. It can serve as a roadmap. It's not exactly a plan, of course, and there are 1,000 details to be argued every day. Is natural gas really green? Is nuclear green? And so on. So these are inevitable points of debate. But broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is well done and well worth achieving, and well worth promoting diplomatically, to say to the Latin American countries, to the African Union, to ASEAN, and so on, you need a Green Deal the same way we have a Green Deal. Europe could really provide a lot of leadership that way.
When it comes to the Green Deal taxonomy, what's really important for the Czech Republic and even some other Central European countries, do you think that the nuclear power should be viewed as sustainable going forward, and that Germany should actually bring its, sort of reverse its policy of shutting down nuclear power plants?
I think nuclear power, if, and this is a big if it can be managed safely, so that with the absolute state-of-the-art safety systems, especially passive safety systems, offers a component of the zero carbon energy system. I don't believe, I'm not myself a purist that says absolutely no to nuclear power. Of course, it raises many issues: fissile materials, nuclear safety, nuclear waste, and the alternatives. Because if you could do it without nuclear through an efficient system of wind, solar, hydro, and so forth, there's a lot of merit to that. But I think within the practical context, there's no doubt that nuclear power is going to continue to play its role, obviously in France, obviously in Central Europe, obviously in China, in Korea, in
Ukraine,
a lot of
in
countries
Russia.
in the world. Well, in Russia and Ukraine, I would expect so also, absolutely.
First, I want to talk with you a bit about the supposed switch from a unipolar world, which is dominated by US hegemony, to a multipolar world where other governments, especially in the global south, are given more agency and more say in how the world is run. So lately, I've really kind of felt that the switch to a multipolar world has accelerated quite a bit, especially with the diplomatic gains China has made in the Middle East. So I was wondering if you believe that we're truly heading into a new multipolar paradigm. And I was also wondering what you think that might look like.
Well, the world is changing, and it's changing very fast from not just a unipolar world with the U.S. Role as a so-called hegemon, but really from a North Atlantic-led world of the last 2 centuries to a world where economy, finance, power is much more spread around the world. The industrial era began in England. It's therefore no real surprise that England or Britain became the first industrial global empire. And Britain ruled the seas and really ruled much of the world during the 19th century. And other European newly industrialized countries formed their own empires in Africa and in Asia. And that Western-led or North Atlantic-led world continued throughout the 20th century. But after 2 disastrous world wars and a Great Depression, the global leadership of the North Atlantic shifted from Western Europe and Britain to the United States. So the U.S. has been the dominant power since 1945. But with independence of India, the end of empire across Africa, the restoration of real sovereignty of China, starting with the formation of the People's Republic in 1949, and with the economics that has followed that, the world economy has rebalanced. The spread of technology has become far more equal. China, of course, has become one of the lead economies and centers of innovation of the world. India is one of the fastest growing large economies of the world. The world's changing. And for me, a notable point is that the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now, when measured at so-called international prices, have larger output than the G7 countries, than the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. So that's a notable change. All of this means we're moving to a multipolar world. None of it means that the United States likes it or accepts it right now. So psychologically, the U.S. is having a very hard time, and it's trying to hold on to its dominance. But that's just not possible in a world of diverse talents, skills, innovation, economy, when the US is just 4% of the world population.
Yeah, I get the feeling that a lot of people, especially in the West, have this idea that they might suffer under a multipolar order. So do you think that fear is warranted, or can the US and the collective West continue to succeed in a more multipolar world?
You know, as an economist, I'm a believer in a win-win world. I don't believe that globalization or the rise of China or the rise of India or the rise of Africa in any way diminishes the opportunities for well-being in the United States or Europe. Indeed, I think it enhances those possibilities. In any event, we need cooperation to face challenges like human-induced climate change. So, for all of those reasons, I believe in a win-win world where gains from trade and advances in economy from technological advances can and should spread around the world. If you are a military strategist or a geopolitical strategist, it seems that the feeling is quite different, that the gain of the other is somehow a loss for you. And so I know that international relations realists sometimes think that China's rise is detrimental to the United States. It's a different mindset. I think it's a dangerous mindset, actually, to think in that way, because it almost inevitably leads to confrontation and the real chance of deadly conflict. And so I want to emphasize the win-win nature of the world economy. It's not one region's gain necessarily at the expense of the other. Everybody can benefit from the advancement of know-how and technology and scientific understanding.
I'm really crossing my fingers. I too am really pushing for a win-win kind of situation. Now, the US and China have gone through obviously a really rough patch in terms of relations of late, with Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan last year, to Balloongate, to these allegations of widespread genocide against the Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, to calls for war by 2025, to the Select Committee on so-called competition with the CPC. And of course, lately, we also have TikTok and the mainstream media's kind of feverish obsession with Yellow Peril 2.0, kind of painting China as this dark, dangerous, dirty dystopia. Why is it, do you think, that the US is seemingly so obsessed with tearing China down at the present moment? And what do you think it would take for those relations to improve?
I think almost all of this is the result of China's success. The United States strategists and politicians didn't want a peer or a rival competitor, and then China showed up on the scenes as a large, successful economy that for 40 years plus, since 1980, has been one of the most dynamic parts of the world economy, and now at the cutting edge of many leading technologies. And I think the United States political class resents this, is fearful of it. The geostrategists who think in terms of zero-sum struggles think that China's advances to the detriment of the United States. Again, a mindset I don't believe and don't accept, and think is actually a very dangerous one. But most of this is a reaction to China's success. And I think that it needs to be overcome through systematic dialogue, negotiation, hammering out solutions where there are real differences, not the shouting, the finger pointing, the kind of hysteria. Of course, there's a lot of prejudice built in as well. You mentioned Yellow Peril 2.0. Well, there is some feeling wrong in the United States that if China has advanced, they must have cheated to do it. How could they be a competitor with us, after all? This is pretty ingrained and is wrong. I say to these people, get a passport, go take a visit, go learn something, read some history, understand the long sweep of history. I wrote a book in 2020 called The Ages of Globalization, in which China features for hundreds and hundreds of years as the world-leading economy, the source of major technological advances. I explain the swings that happened afterwards, but I see China's recovering a natural position as one of the world leaders in innovation and technology. And from my point of view, that's all to the good. But this is not the mindset right now. And I think we have to work hard so that the mindset of fear and zero-sum thinking doesn't overwhelm us and doesn't lead to open conflict, which it could.
Now, speaking of having a passport and getting around, you've been to a few places. You've given economic advice to a number of governments, including those of Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. And in Poland, you were awarded one of that country's highest honors, the Order of Merit, for authorizing a comprehensive plan to switch from a central planned model to the market economy. So I was wondering, based on your vast experience in that area, how you would summarize China's reform and opening up over the past 40-odd years. And do you agree with the idea that this country's witnessed kind of an economic miracle that's without precedent?
China has been the most successful, sustained 40-year economic development and growth of any large economy in history. What's happened in the period since 1980 is extraordinary and extraordinarily positive. China went from being a society with most people living in poverty. The numbers depend on definitions, but 60% poor, some estimate 80% poor, to ending poverty in its extreme form by 2020. Well, that's a phenomenal achievement, and it reflects a mixed economic system, both market and state, private and public, a tremendous capacity to plan at the National Development and Reform Commission, among other institutions, the tremendous capacity to build infrastructure, thousands and thousands of kilometers of fast intercity rail, of roads, of a power system, and so forth, on a massive scale. And the Chinese economy lives on that physical infrastructure that connects the entire country. I've been watching this process closely since my first visit to China 42 years ago. So I came in 1981. China was very poor then. This was very clear just by looking at life as one would see it on the streets or in the shops. I've been visiting China frequently ever since 1981. And what has happened is absolutely extraordinary, hugely beneficial for China and beneficial for the whole world.
So do you think then that China has achieved anything specifically in their poverty alleviation process that maybe other states might be able to emulate?
Well, I say to my friends and governments in Africa that look at what China did over a 40-year period. Africa uses the date, interestingly, of 2063 as its reference point because 2063 will be the 100th anniversary of African unity and the foundation of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which is the precursor of the African Union. So they look to 2063. Here we are in 2023. Okay, 40 years. Think of China, 1980 to 2020. Think of Africa, 2023 to 2063. China provides an inspiration and in many important ways, a kind of roadmap. Invest heavily, build infrastructure, get the kids in school, make the quality education, make the real investments that build the capacity of the economy. It's not gimmickry that brought China to its current prosperity. It is heavy investments, large scale, over a long period with good planning, good public administration, and educating generations of Chinese young people in skills, in scientific capacity, and so on. So I think there's a lot that is a roadmap for other regions.
Interesting. Now, to switch gears just a little bit, although kind of related, inflation has been a massive problem recently, but China's inflation rate is currently sitting at 1%, while the US is around 6% and the UK is about 10.4%, I think. In layman's terms, how is it that China is able to keep inflation so low, and do you think that rate will last?
Well, the inflation that is being experienced in the US and Europe is the result of dislocations that came from COVID and from the Ukraine war and from the sanctions that were imposed by the US and Europe in the wake of the war, and from the policy choices that were made in response to these shocks, especially in the year 2020, when the pandemic broke out. The central banks of the United States and Europe issued a lot of credit, a massive expansion of the money supply. And that turned into inflation by 2022. And the disruptions of the global supply chains, first from COVID itself, but then from the war and the geopolitical tensions with China and the sanctions regimes, when combined with the money expansion, boosted the inflation. China didn't do the same thing. China didn't make this massive monetary expansion in 2020 the way the Federal Reserve did. And China is not experiencing the same disruptions that came from the sanctions regimes, which have in some sense boomeranged on the sanctioning countries because it's disrupted their own supply chains. So I think this is partly the result of shocks and partly the result of policy choices, and I'd say some policy mistakes that were made in the West. There's no reason why this phenomenon has to be a global phenomenon in the same way.
Now I kind of want to flip about 180 degrees. What do you think happened with Nord Stream?
Well, Nord Stream was a project that the United States opposed from its inception. Nord Stream is the gas pipeline from Russia to Western Europe, and the United States said from the very start that Europe should not buy gas from Russia. I disagree with that analysis, but the US said, well, that will make Europe dependent on Russia. To my mind, it's not a matter of dependency, it's a matter of economics and trade. Russia has a lot of inexpensive gas. Europe has a great manufacturing capacity. Buying that gas is good for Europe's competitiveness and for production. And that's where the pipeline idea came from. But the U.S. hated the pipeline. The U.S. said, well, this makes Europe follow Russia's geopolitics and so forth. I think that this was not the right approach. But it all leads me to believe that the most likely scenario of Nord Stream is the U.S. blew it up because the U.S. hated the project. The U.S. warned that in the event of a Russian invasion, the pipeline would end. President Biden himself said that on tape on February 7th, 2022. And when the reporter asked, but Mr. President, that's an international project, how can you say it will end? He said, believe me, we have our ways. Well, I think we probably saw those ways with the destruction of the pipeline. It's not proved. The story that the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has put out is very credible, and it has not been knocked down in any substantive way. And I had the opportunity to speak to the members of the UN Security Council and strongly urged an independent UN-led investigation. Let's get to the bottom of it. Countries know more than they're telling. We need to investigate. Well, China and Russia and Brazil said, yes, let's investigate. The United States said no. Well, why do you say no? We need to find out. So I continue to urge the UN to investigate this because we need security of international infrastructure. And when a major pipeline is blown up, it's actually a global threat to the peace.
What do you think are the chances of the UN undertaking an investigation?
Well, I hope more and more countries support the idea of an independent investigation because there are many facts that need to be known, and because if we're going to succeed in fighting climate change, for example, we're going to need a lot of international infrastructure. We want it to be secure. We don't want it to be blown up. So when there is a major piece of infrastructure blown up, I say it's a threat to the peace in the sense that we need fiber, we need pipelines, we need power grids in submarine cables to make our world economy function properly. So we need security of the international infrastructure.
Do you think TikTok will be blocked in the US?
We're in a kind of mode of hysteria and panic and anti-China everything. So everything's possible. It's really, really discouraging to see our Congress waste time on this. And the anti-China feeling, has tried to destroy a lot of Chinese companies in recent years. Huawei, another one that was hard hit, but is finding its way around the U.S. Sanctions regime. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that Congress calms down. I hope that all of the U.S. geopolitics directed at China calms down. We need dialogue, discussion, negotiation. We don't need a ban on TikTok.
Okay, last question for today. Is the US a dying empire, and is all the provocation and calls for war and smearing and so on evidence of the last, desperate throes of US hegemony? And if so, how can we keep safe and avoid nuclear war?
Well, look, the US is not and cannot be the global hegemon, meaning it can't be the country that runs the world. The US is 4% of the world. There's a lot of talent, creativity, and desire for sovereignty and for a say in world affairs all over the world. So the US is not the world hegemon, but it needs, at the political level, to get its head around that reality. To have a foreign policy not based on arrogance or illusion, but based on an interconnected world and the need for cooperation and peace. And I think it's possible to have that. The US can be quite successful in such a world. What can't occur is the US running the world. That's not going to happen. And if the US persists in trying that, it's going to face more and more conflict around the world with other nations. So I think this is a question of the US accepting the principle that we have a multipolar world and that we should make it work properly.